from South Africa, I replied. In South Africa, the government has never supported writers. In South Africa, the only body ever established for writers was intended to hinder them from proceeding in their work, not helping them. That is why I look surprised. In South Africa, we thought we were lucky if the government ignored what we were doing. I'm going to speak tonight about censorship, which was very much a fact of life for writers in South Africa until about 1990, when the legislation created by the apartheid state began to be dismantled. Under that legislation, no book could be sold until it had received the approval of a faceless committee of censors. Faceless in the sense that their identities were not made public. Censorship was the background against which all South African artists operated. Novelists, playwrights, poets, filmmakers. Not unnaturally, I developed an interest in censorship, not just the South African system, but censorship in general as a historical phenomenon. In due course, I wrote a book on the subject, published in the United States under the title Giving Offense, in which I discussed the effects of state censorship, not only in South Africa, but also in the then Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. My interest in the subject revived recently when a new book on the South African censorship system came out. It was called The Literature Police. It was by Peter MacDonald, who teaches at Oxford University. The researches into the censor's archives by MacDonald and another South African scholar named Herman Wittenberg have been an eye-opener, not only to myself, but to other South African writers as well, of my generation, giving us an intimate look at how our activities had been viewed by the authorities of the day. When I say my generation, I mean writers who came to maturity during the approximately 4 decades of National Party rule. Writers who practiced their profession under the eye of the apartheid state. In the first part of this lecture, I plan to revisit 3 books of mine, dating from the 1970s and 1980s. Books about which the censor's records are particularly revealing. After that, I want to go on and make some general remarks about censorship. But before I can do any of that, I need to explain briefly what the South African system was meant to achieve and how it worked. In the 1970s, when I began publishing, the South African state was moving from what I would call the utopian phase of apartheid to what I would call its realpolitik phase. In the utopian phase, the party in power believed that it could build a wall around the country to isolate and insulate it from the world. And then, within that protective wall, organize and run a society that would conform as closely as could be, given that man's nature is a fallen nature, to what it understood to be God's dictate, its God being the Protestant God of Calvin. In the realpolitik phase, the party revised its ambitions downward. It now saw itself as engaged in the African theatre of a worldwide war, sometimes cold, sometimes hot, a war in which white South Africa might yet be able to use its strategic mineral resources to negotiate a place on the winning side, which would, of course, be the side of the United States. One of the instruments of state control during both of these phases was censorship. And bear it in mind that we're talking about a pre-electronic age now, when the only practical means of transmitting texts was by print. A cumbersome method, as we can now see in retrospect, a method that can easily be interrupted or closed down. The goals of the censorship system were two. First, to ensure that the nation, meaning in the first place, the white nation, would not be infected by what it saw as the moral decay of the West, but on the contrary, would remain strong, virile, and confident. Second aim was to ensure that communist propaganda would not enter the country to give aid and comfort and instruction to the forces of darkness.